Good evening. The two men found guilty of killing the black teenager, Stephen Lawrence, have been jailed for his murder. Gary Dobson was sentenced to at least 15 years in prison and David Norris 14. The sentences reflected the fact that the two men were juveniles when they committed the crime 18 years ago. Referring to the other suspects, the judge said he hoped the police would not close the file on the murder. And tonight, the police say they've received new information about the case. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons, reports.
For the parents of Stephen Lawrence, justice was delivered today, but not in its entirety. They welcome the sentences, even though they know it's not over yet.
These people have now realized that they've been found out. And it's now going to go and lay down in their bed and think that they weren't the only ones who were responsible for the death of my son. And they're going to give up the other rest of the people.
The sentences that happened, it may be quite low, but at the same time, the judge's hands were tied. And for that, and for as much as he can do, I was very grateful.
David Norris and Gary Dobson are detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. They won't be released until the late 2020s at the earliest. The court was packed. Seats given up by barristers for some of the Lawrence family. When the sentences were handed down, nothing was said by the convicted men, though afterwards there was a shout from one of their supporters in the public gallery. Shame on all of you. The judge, Mr. Justice Tracy, said, a totally innocent 18-year-old youth on the threshold of a promising life was brutally cut down in the street in front of eyewitnesses by a racist, thuggish gang. The pair were juveniles when they murdered Stephen and when police put them under surveillance. Under law, the judge had to sentence them not as the mature men they are now, but as the teenagers they were in 1993. The sentence could have been as short as 12 years. Extra time was added because of the racial nature of this case, but the resulting sentences, 14 and 15 years, are far shorter than the 30 years a modern adult murderer could have received. The judge also said he hoped the conviction of Norris, here being interviewed by police, and Dobson would not result in the case file being closed. Senior detectives have told the BBC in the last 24 hours new information has come in.
The other people involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence should not rest easily in their beds. We are still investigating this case. And I'd just like to take this opportunity, if anybody out there has any more information or any evidence, even after all this time, please tell us, and then we'll do the rest.
9 people remain of interest to police. They include Luke Knight, Neil Acortt and his brother Jamie. They've never been convicted of violence despite a series of allegations. In 1993, Neil Acortt and David Norris were said to have attacked a youth, Stacey Benefield. Norris was acquitted, Neil Acortt never charged.
Well, these are the scars.
And this is Darren Giles.
That's the heart one now.
In 1994, he intervened in a nightclub row Jamie Acortt was having with his friend. Mr. Acortt stabbed Darren Giles in the heart.
My heart stopped for about 12 minutes. And so there was no oxygen getting to my brain. So I don't remember a thing. And I was dead for about 12 minutes, basically, you know.
BBC News. But Jamie Acortt, who's refused to speak to the BBC, was acquitted. A jury decided he'd acted in self-defence. These incidents don't provide evidence any of the 3 men killed Stephen Lawrence. They all deny that, and police currently have no information to act on. The Stephen Lawrence case has become one of the most significant in recent legal history. But what happens next? Well, nobody knows. Tom Simons, BBC News at the Old Bailey.
In court, the judge said Stephen Lawrence's killers were motivated by racial hatred. His murder and the failures of the initial police investigation raised stark questions about race relations in Britain and the treatment of ethnic minorities by the police. Nearly 2 decades on, have the police and public attitudes changed? This report from South London by our Home editor Mark Easton contains some racially offensive language.
Almost 2 decades after Stephen Lawrence's racist murder on a London street, how much scope for celebration is there in terms of improved race relations?
South London's finest and represent.
No one actually is born racist.
The DJs at Represent Radio reflect the self-confidence of their young, largely black audience in South London.
Do you think the colour of your skin makes much difference to the way your life goes?
I try not to see it like that. I know it probably does, and you know, I've been in situations where, you know, I can see in a person's eyes that there's a sort of a judgment, but I think I try and see that as more self-paranoia rather than actually based on anything.
Waves of immigration have shaped highly diverse neighbourhoods in some of Britain's inner cities, communities which have become used to racial difference, but where today I still found tension, even prejudice, just below the surface.
Don't think they was guilty.
Really?
Really.
Do you think there was a stitch-up then, or what?
I think there was a stitch-up and one little speck.
And why was that? Why do you think that was done then?
I don't know, because it's a nigger been done, isn't it?
Such open prejudice is to most highly offensive, but it's also rare. Government research recently found that only around 1 in 10 people from ethnic minorities think racism is a very or even fairly big problem in their neighbourhood. The relationship between the police and black people in London is also improved. But as Stephen, a voluntary youth worker, told me, tensions still exist.
I've been stopped and searched about 3 to 4 times in one day. You know what I mean? And for me, it just feels like, why is it always we? You know what I mean? Because it felt like I've been targeted.
In 1993, the proportion of Met officers from ethnic minorities was just over 2%. Today, it's just under 10%. The local police chief told me the force has come a long way.
The images of life on Mars and that sort of culture did exist, but not in the way that it's portrayed sometimes around racism. But, you know, it's more about our relationship with how we police the diverse communities in London and how we understand those diverse communities.
Racism still exists in Britain, but in multicultural urban communities like here in South London, it is subtle, hidden, and publicly pretty much unacceptable. What does exist is anxiety and hostility towards new migrants who are seen as competitors in the battle for increasingly scarce public resources.
Our children, what are they going to do when they grow up? I mean, they're not going to get a flat and a job if we can't get them now, are they?
But do you blame black people, brown people for that?
No, I don't. I blame the government. I think the government's the whole, because why they let all the immigrants in here? Other countries like Australia won't take them, so why do we?
The majority of people I met on South London streets thought race relations were pretty good, certainly better than 20 years ago. But no one argued that Stephen Lawrence's death had seen prejudice and bigotry defeated. Mark Easton, BBC News, South London.
The race to become the Republicans'